Have you ever been the kind of person who would rather not gain an extra $100 than risk losing $100? On the surface, those two things sound almost the same. But if you place yourself in two different situations, the feeling is completely different. Imagine this. One ordinary day, you walk past a store and see they're running a small raffle promotion. You might win an extra 1 million Vietnamese dong. But you might also win nothing. If you don't participate, nothing really happens. You simply don't gain any extra money. The feeling is neutral. Now let's change the situation. You already have 1 million dong in your wallet. And there's a game. If you win, nothing changes. But if you lose that 1 million. Suddenly the feeling becomes very different. It's no longer, oh well, it's basically the same. Instead, a very clear sense of discomfort usually appears in your mind. Something like, maybe I shouldn't play. It's not worth it. What if I lose? I once noticed this in a very small situation. At one point I invested a small amount of money into something that friends said was pretty decent. When the value went up a little, I felt happy. But honestly, the happiness was quite mild. Then the price started dropping. And suddenly I found myself opening my phone constantly. Checking every few minutes. Not because I wanted to make more money. But because I didn't want to lose the money I already had. It was a strange feeling. When there's a chance to gain more, the brain reacts fairly calmly. But when there's a risk of losing something you already possess, the sense of tension rises noticeably. Later, after reading more research in psychology and behavioral science, I discovered that this phenomenon actually has a well-known name. Loss aversion. In simple terms, for the human brain, the pain of losing something is usually stronger than the pleasure of gaining the same thing. Losing $100 often hurts much more than the happiness of gaining $100. And the interesting part is this. This isn't because we are weak. And it isn't because we are too greedy. It has very deep roots. In biological evolution. In how the brain processes threats. In the survival mechanisms that shaped humans tens of thousands of years ago. In other words, our brains were not designed to maximize winning. They were designed to avoid losing as much as possible. And sometimes, that very mechanism can make us hold on to things that are no longer good for us. Fear change. Avoid risks. Or make decisions that later feel very strange in hindsight. I've experienced this myself. There were things I held onto for far too long simply because I thought, if I let this go, it would be a waste. There were decisions I didn't dare make because one question kept echoing in my mind. What if I lose? But to really understand this, we have to look a little deeper. Not into philosophy, but into what is actually happening inside the brain whenever the possibility of loss appears. After reading quite a bit of research in behavioral psychology and neuroscience, I realized something slightly surprising. Our brains were not designed to treat winning and losing equally. They are biased. And the bias is very clear. If we had to summarize it in an extremely simple way, it would be this. The brain reacts to loss almost the same way it reacts to danger. Not philosophical danger, but real biological threat. To understand this, imagine that your brain works like a home alarm system. Inside that system, there is a very important structure called the amygdala. You can think of it like the motion sensor of the house. Its job is simple. Detect anything that might cause harm. Thousands of years ago, something that might cause harm meant things like a noise in the bushes, the tracks of a predator, a shortage of food, the loss of resources. If someone in a tribe lost food, lost shelter, or lost resources, their chance of survival dropped immediately. So over tens of thousands of years of evolution, The brain learned a very simple rule. Losing what you already have equals danger. What about gaining something new? That's good. But it's not as urgent. You can imagine it like this. If you currently have 5 days of food and you lose 2 days' worth, that's a serious problem. But if you have 5 days of food and gain 2 extra days, life is better. But it's not an immediate survival issue. The brain processes these two situations very differently. Neuroscience studies have shown that when people face the possibility of loss, brain regions associated with pain, vigilance, stress become significantly more active. Certain hormones and neurotransmitters are also involved. For example, cortisol, the stress hormone, can increase when the brain perceives a risk of losing something important. Meanwhile, when you gain a reward, the brain often releases dopamine. Dopamine creates feelings of excitement and motivation. But there is an interesting detail. Dopamine is like applause from the brain. The reaction to loss is more like a fire alarm. One side says, "Oh, that's nice." The other side says, "Something is wrong. Pay attention immediately." That's why the emotional intensity is often unbalanced. The joy of winning is usually milder than the pain of losing the same amount. Behavioral economists have even estimated that for many people, the pain of loss can feel roughly twice as strong as the pleasure of gaining the same value. And this mechanism doesn't apply only to money. It appears in many parts of life. Relationships, careers, reputation, time, even personal opinions. For example, a compliment might make you feel good for a few minutes, but a single criticism can stay in your mind for the entire day, or sometimes for years. Not because you're weak, but because your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Prioritize detecting and avoiding loss. The problem is, this mechanism was designed for a wild world tens of thousands of years ago. And we are now living in a completely different environment. Sometimes, this survival mechanism causes people to hold onto things they should let go of, fear risks that might actually be worth taking, or make very strange decisions after a loss has already happened. And that's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because what happens after loss begins to appear is what truly shapes human behavior. One thing I realized after learning about the brain's loss aversion mechanism is this. Many decisions that later seem stupid were not stupid at the moment they were made. At that moment, the brain was simply trying to avoid the pain of losing more. Take a very familiar example. You buy something slightly expensive. A phone, an online course, some kind of device. After some time, you realize, I don't actually need this that much. But you keep using it. You keep holding onto it. You might even convince yourself that it's still useful. Why? Partly because the brain hates the feeling of admitting that money has already been wasted. If you throw it away, a clear feeling appears in your mind. I already lost that money. But if you keep it, the brain can continue telling a more comfortable story. It's okay, I'm still using it. In psychology, this phenomenon is known as the sunk cost effect. But what matters more is the internal feeling. When loss appears, the brain doesn't react purely with logic. It reacts with biological emotion. Cortisol rises. The alert system activates. The internal sensation feels like tension, discomfort, a strong urge to fix the mistake immediately. And this is when people start doing some very interesting things. For example, someone loses money in a card game. Instead of stopping, they continue playing to win it back. Not because they believe it's a smart strategy, but because a very familiar thought appears. If I stop now, the loss becomes real. But if they keep playing, maybe I can get it back. The same pattern appears in many areas of life. In investing, in careers, in relationships. Some people stay in exhausting jobs for years. Not because they love the work, but because they think, I've already spent so many years here. Some people remain in relationships that are no longer healthy. Not because they are happy, but because they feel, we've invested so many years, leaving now would be a waste. From the outside, these decisions can be hard to understand. But from the perspective of the brain, they are surprisingly logical. The brain is trying to do one thing: avoid making the loss feel fully real. The problem is, when we try to avoid the pain of an initial loss, we sometimes create much larger losses later. A small investment becomes a major loss. A wrong decision stretches into many years. An unhealthy relationship becomes a long-term burden. And the ironic part is, in the moment, everything still feels reasonable. Only months or years later do we look back and ask, why didn't I stop earlier? The answer usually isn't a lack of intelligence. It's a very ancient mechanism in the brain. The brain fears loss more than it enjoys winning. But understanding this mechanism is not the most important part. The more important question is this: if the brain is designed this way, what should we actually do about it? After learning about loss aversion, I once thought the solution was simple. Maybe the answer is, stop being afraid of loss. It sounds bold, confident, almost heroic. But the more I read and the more I observed real life, the more I realized, that is not the right goal. In fact, the brain's fear of loss is extremely useful. If our ancestors had not feared loss, they might have consumed all their food in a single day, taken extremely dangerous risks, or ignored real threats. In other words, loss aversion is not a flaw in the brain. It's a safety system. The problem only appears when that system operates in a world very different from the one it was designed for. In the past, losses usually meant loss of food, loss of shelter, loss of survival resources. Today, losses might be a small investment, a career opportunity, a relationship that no longer fits, or even just a wrong decision in the past. But the brain still reacts as if it's facing a survival threat. That's why a common mistake people make is trying to become completely fearless about risk. You may have heard phrases like, success requires bold risks. Don't be afraid to lose. Go big. They sound powerful. But in reality, that mindset sometimes creates a different kind of extreme. Instead of being controlled by fear of loss, people try to pretend they are immune to it. But the human brain doesn't work that way. Biological mechanisms cannot simply be switched off. What we really need is not to eliminate the fear of loss. We need to manage it. I began thinking about this like the brake system in a car. What are brakes for? Not to stop you from ever driving, but also not to let you press the accelerator without any control. Brakes exist so you can manage risk while moving forward. The brain's fear of loss works the same way. Without it, you might make extremely dangerous decisions. But if it becomes too strong, you may never move at all. So the real goal isn't, how do I stop being afraid of loss? The real goal is, how do I recognize when fear of loss is pushing me toward worse decisions? For example, holding onto an investment just because you already put money into it. Staying in a job that is draining your energy. Continuing an argument simply because you don't want to lose. In those situations, the problem is no longer about avoiding loss. It's about avoiding the moment of admitting that the loss has already happened. And sometimes, the most important skill in life is not always winning. It's knowing when to stop. Once the cost becomes larger than the benefit. It sounds simple. But in practice, It is one of the hardest skills for humans to develop, because it goes directly against the brain's survival instincts. Fortunately, there are some practical ways to reduce the influence of this mechanism. Not by changing your personality, but by changing how you handle decisions over time. When I first understood loss aversion, I thought simply recognizing it would be enough. But reality is not that simple. Because when you are already inside a situation where loss is possible, the brain's alert system is usually activated. Stress hormones rise. Emotions become stronger. In that moment, thinking clearly is not always easy. So the most helpful approaches are not about thinking better, but about changing how decisions are handled at different stages. I found 4 moments that matter the most. 1. Before the decision, define an acceptable level of loss. One simple but powerful method is deciding in advance how much loss you are willing to accept. This is very common in investing. Many people only think about how much they might gain. But experienced investors often think in reverse. If this goes wrong, how much am I willing to lose? This works because it moves the decision from a high emotion moment to a low emotion moment. When you set limits ahead of time, you prevent the brain from negotiating with fear during the most stressful moment. It's like installing a safety brake. The limitation of this method is obvious. You can still break your own rules, but at least you create a clear stopping point. 2. When loss is happening, separate the past from the present decision. One question I learned that is extremely useful is this: if I had never invested money, time, or effort into this, would I start it today? This question helps separate past costs from present decisions. The brain loves mixing them together. For example, I've already spent 3 years in this job. But the real question should be, if today were day 1, would I choose this job again? This approach works because it reduces the influence of the sunk cost effect. Its limitation is that when emotions are very strong, you might still avoid answering honestly. But if you face the question sincerely, it often creates a completely different perspective. 3. Immediately after a loss, avoid the urge to recover instantly. One very common reflex of the brain is trying to win back what was lost immediately. This happens in gambling, investing, arguments, even relationships. When loss appears, the brain wants to restore the previous state as quickly as possible. But this is often when people make their worst decisions. That's why a very simple rule many people follow is: do not make major decisions immediately after a loss. Give the brain time to cool down. A few hours. A day. Sometimes a few days. This works because cortisol and stress responses do not stay elevated forever. When emotions settle down, perspective usually changes dramatically. 4. The next day and in the long run, focus on systems, not individual wins and losses. A common mistake is evaluating life based on individual outcomes. Win or lose. Gain or loss. But in reality, life is more like a very long chain of small decisions. If your decision-making system is good, you can still lose a few times. That does not mean the system itself is wrong. This mindset reduces the pressure of each individual loss. Instead of asking, "Did I just lose?" you begin asking, "Over the long run, is my decision-making process sound?" The limitation is clear. No system eliminates loss completely, but it prevents you from getting trapped in a single wrong decision for too long. After understanding all this, I began to look at loss a little differently. Not as something that must be avoided at all costs, but as an unavoidable part of any life that includes choice and risk. The real problem is not, how do I avoid losing forever? The real question is, how do I prevent a small loss from becoming a much bigger one? And that's where the idea of winning starts to change. After learning about loss aversion, I looked back at many decisions in my own life. And I noticed something slightly funny. Many times I believed I was trying to win. But in reality, I was only trying to avoid losing. Those two things sound similar. But if you think carefully, they are very different. When you are trying to win, you focus on the real value of what you are doing. Long-term potential. What is truly worth investing your time and energy into? But when you are only trying to avoid losing, your mind shifts in another direction. You begin thinking, how do I avoid losing? How do I avoid looking wrong? How do I hold on to what I've already spent? And in that process, many people get stuck in things that are no longer good for them. A job that no longer helps them grow. A project that clearly isn't working. A relationship where both people are exhausted. Not because they don't recognize the problem, but because accepting the initial loss is often much harder than continuing to endure it. But if you zoom out a little, life is not a game with only one round. It's more like a very long sequence of decisions. In such a long sequence, loss is not proof of failure. It's simply the cost of learning. A failed investment. A plan that didn't work out. A choice that turned out to be wrong. These things do not mean you have lost the game. They only mean you paid a fee to learn something. The real problem begins when we try to avoid acknowledging that fee. That's when the brain starts doing strange things. It makes us hold on to things that no longer have value. It makes us afraid of change. It makes us extend bad decisions simply to avoid admitting the truth. So there is one perspective that I find quite helpful. Instead of trying to live a life without loss, a more realistic goal might be to live a life where losses are recognized early, mistakes are stopped in time, and one wrong decision does not lead to many more wrong decisions. It sounds simple, but in reality, this is one of the hardest skills humans must learn. Because it requires us to do something the brain really dislikes. Admit that sometimes we were wrong. But in return, you gain something extremely valuable. You no longer need to spend more time, energy, and opportunity on things that clearly no longer fit your life. And in a way, that is also a form of victory. Not a loud victory, but a quiet one. The ability to move forward without carrying old decisions with you. The content in this video is intended to share scientific knowledge and personal perspectives about human psychology and behavior. Based on research in psychology and neuroscience. It does not replace professional medical, psychological, or financial advice. If you are experiencing serious mental health issues, prolonged stress, or are currently undergoing medical treatment, please consult a qualified doctor or professional specialist for appropriate guidance.